All right. And here we go. Welcome back to the DFI Podcast, where we go deep on Web3 infrastructure, use cases and services. Ishan, good to connect with you again.
Yes. Sorry I'm late. So I don't know how long of an episode this is going to be, but we will try to keep it interesting.
It's good. We're increasing the value for people's time. Well, like one of our favorite recurring themes is the SEC, and so maybe we should start there. There's like some rumors that something's gonna happen finally with the SEC ETFs. Is that right?
Yeah. So it looks like So this report came out a month ago. So I actually don't know what the current state is. But a month ago, it was somebody reported that the SEC is likely to approve several Bitcoin ETFs, right? And did that happen? Like, do we know that happened?
Still has not. The latest I heard was that they were putting it up for a review period. Okay. The latest I heard was that the SEC they can put a review period up to like 200 days for open comment, which is could be sort of a stalling tactic. But it's definitely the ball's in their court right now. They have a number of pending applications they could approve at any point.
Yeah. So apparently, I'm reading this, by the way, from Reuters. A 3-judge panel of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals in Washington last week ruled the SEC was wrong to reject Grayscale's proposed Bitcoin ETF without explaining its reasoning. So it looks like Grayscale did make a Bitcoin ETF proposal. It got rejected, and then the appeals court said the SEC was wrong to reject it. This is also kind of interesting because we're just not even talking about like Bitcoin and Web3 and all of these things, but this is also like gets into like, and maybe this is a different topic, but what the executive branch of the government can and can't do without reasoning and providing evidence to the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the citizens, right? So I'm not sure why they rejected it, right? But it sounds like it's just not. It sounds like the judicial branch wants the executive branch to be more open and show more detail of why they're saying no when they do reject things, or vice versa.
Yes. No, I mean, that's the best contentious aspect between the judicial branch and the executive branch and these regulatory agencies is that the regulatory agencies cannot make law. So if it's not clearly within their responsibility, in this case, to deny an application for an ETF, according to law, then they have to give additional consideration. So I forget. There's some specific grounds in terms of reasons why the judge ruled in the favor of Grayscale BTC, but it's a great step in the right direction. Now, either the SEC is going to have to come back with additional findings, additional reasons for it not to become an ETF, or they're going to have to approve it effectively.
Yeah. I mean, either way, I think this is a good step because regardless of whether the SEC approves it or not, now you've had a judicial branch or a member of the judicial branch this court saying that, if the SEC is going to start rejecting stuff, like there needs to be more information right now. We'll talk about this later, but like the world is quickly adopting crypto regulations. There was a G20 in India last week or the week before, and there are a bunch of countries who wanted to sign up for like a global crypto regulating framework, right? Mostly on tax evasion, but still it's in the right step. So, again, we've been talking a lot about regulatory, but I really think the Biden administration needs to step up its game on, we've heard like the FTC, the CFTC, and the SEC all fighting on different parts of crypto, right? Because what is a commodity and what is a security? And that's what that's the executive branch. And then Congress needs to figure out like, hey, how do we pass a bill that stops fraud, that stops tax evasion, but enables Web3 and crypto innovation in America? And it seems like the executive branch of the government is not any closer to doing anything than what we've been talking about the last 2 months, right? It seems that some progress is being made on the legislative branch and like just BlackRock and other companies want to get Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs out and the executive branches. And so what are your thoughts on that, Wes?
I agree. I mean, like I'm a bit of a cynic in the sense that we're actually getting relatively close to legal action or to new laws being passed when Sam Bankman-Fried was involved in lobbying the SEC and lobbying Congress. They were moving closer to proper regulation. It's unfortunate that there was so much funding required to get that to happen. Now you see the major financial institutions weighing in, the BlackRock and these folks. They do have funding behind them, so they do have a big voice in Congress. And, you know, if BlackRock chooses to do that, okay, that's one example. If Morgan Stanley, Fidelity, when's Fidelity going to do this? What about Vanguard? Vanguard might want to get involved in ETF. They have ETFs for other indices. So if you see that mass like weight behind it and all the lobbying power behind it as well, then I feel like you get to a bit of a tipping point where the SEC just wouldn't have enough political will. You know, like their boss like doesn't want to stand in front of the people that are helping their campaign contributions from getting this ETF passed. But that takes time for them to get comfortable with it, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. And what about there were two bills, right? One in the House and one in the Senate. Are there any updates on that? I feel like, you know, we weren't planning on covering that, but this is almost completely related to, you know, the SEC, because I think the only way crypto innovation goes forward is if Congress passes something that allows us, you know, that allows a framework for like crypto companies in America to understand what the market looks like, what will the SEC and the FTC and the CFTC go after for, what is legal. You know, even like a strict framework at this point would be better than where we are now, which is unclear regulation and the SEC not being helpful.
It's a great point. No, the last I saw was in July. There was a little bit of movement in the House. In the House of Representatives, they had passed a minor bill to get some regulation passed. I don't know if that made its way to the Senate for further review or if it just died after it left the House. But you know, you raised an interesting point. Like, for example, Ted Stevens, a representative from Texas, has some significant industry in Texas that does Bitcoin mining. And so those folks, you know, as the industry grows in America, if there's opportunity for industry growth in America, then those folks get involved and they want to really lobby in favor of these types of bills. So I think there's potential, but I haven't seen any progress in the past few months in the U.S. Senate on those.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, even, I guess, on Texas, right? So I think Ted Cruz, the senator of Texas.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Same thing,
Ted
right?
Stevens.
Yeah. So basically, he supported. He was like, Texas is a hub for jobs, innovation, freedom, making it a natural oasis for Bitcoin mining. And for people who don't know, Texas is the largest producer of renewable energy in the country. Both wind and solar combined is more than any other state, right? Normally, you would think like California, given the size, and but it's Texas.
Wow.
And another thing that people were like, hey, Bitcoin mining takes a lot of energy. And he's like, no, Bitcoin mining can be shut off, you know, can be turned off in times when we need energy. So we want Bitcoin mining and other mining, crypto mining, to be in Texas. So there have been more and more politicians on both sides of the aisle, right, being like, we should be pro-crypto. I think one, Senator Cruz's, you know, view on this was interesting because he can be like, it can be shut off or shut down. This is not really a problem with energy, right? And two, I think over the long term, we're headed for 100% renewable energy at some point, you know, whatever it might be, 2050, 2060. Every single time somebody puts a projection, we hit it sooner. Like the world's renewable energy from solar, what the target was by 2030 is we're going to hit that before 2030. Probably going to be true for wind, right? If the pace at which China and India and, you know, companies are putting up nuclear is also right, like we'll have a lot more renewable energy. We'll be able to, you know, as long as transmission lines get put up, we'll be able to, you know, put up a lot more energy. And anyone who's doing proof of work, it won't matter that you're using a lot of energy. So to me, that's a non-issue. But it was interesting to see Ted Cruz kind of support Bitcoin and crypto mining in Texas.
I totally agree. It's smart folks over there. Apparently, they shut down the miners for a period of time in the summer where the grid usage was high for like air conditioning purposes, and they actually paid that company a significant surplus just to shut down, so they wouldn't draw energy from the grid. But it just goes to show like the flexibility of mining as a use for like excess energy. So hopefully it continues. So India, what happened with this G20 summit? That's interesting. I'd love to get your take on how that came together.
Yeah. So there are two things that happened, right? I think, so G20 summit happened, I think, it just finished over the weekend, right? So it happened last week, it finished over the weekend. So there's two things happening in India. One, India, the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank, and the national federal government has been generally anti-crypto, and there's a 30% tax on all crypto income in India. Second, as India gets bigger, both from a population perspective and a GDP perspective, it looks like India is going to be a major player in geopolitics and finance and other stuff over the next 20, 30, 50 years, right? Assuming there's no mismanagement of the government and the policy, which I don't know much about, so I'm not going to get into that. But assuming, all things are going well. So what India has done is they announced the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology wants to use NFTs or crypto tokens to sign documents. And essentially it being like on chain, right? So proof that you signed something, and then, your private key or your wallet would be your identity, right? So this has just been, this has been a recommendation by the department, right? There has been no legislative process yet because it hasn't been brought in Parliament. Their version of Congress is called Parliament. Most of the world is a parliamentary democracy, or a parliamentary republic democracy. And so this has not been brought to the legislative branch of the government. But generally what happens is the executive branch of the government makes recommendations, and then, when there is political will behind it, politicians support that recommendation. So that is something that's interesting that's happening in India, right? With this using crypto tokens to digitally sign documents. At the same time, they've also been very pro CBDCs, which is their version is like as far as I know, run on a private blockchain, right? So they're using blockchain technology and Web3 technology and decentralization to build, new financial networks. It's still in testing. And then finally, I read something last week that said there were discussions at the G20 summit in India last week about a global crypto regulation framework around taxes and tax evasion. And so I don't know if this was brought up by India or if it was brought up in the G20 summit in India by another country. But basically there are a bunch of countries that want to have a global framework around tax evasion. So these are the three things that happened in India over the past few months. But what are your thoughts on it from
it's funny, observing the movement of people in the crypto space in other countries. You got like Portugal is popular, Switzerland's popular, Singapore is popular, Dubai, exactly. All these places that are, tax. I'm curious if there's any sort of similar global tax regime that exists today for other types of industry, in the sense, like if I wanted to start a shoe company, do I go to a certain company to avoid shoe company taxes? Are they trying to get back to any kind of norm, or they, from India and from US's perspective, they try to keep businesses here because if they have such bad tax posture towards crypto companies, they're going to push other countries? Are they trying to like, hey, let's all work together so that we don't lose our innovators to your country who's going to have better tax treatment?
I don't know how current tax law works. I know that there was a push and I think that got signed for like a global minimum 15% corporate income tax, right? Because a lot of companies were using tax haven countries, especially in the Caribbean, as their headquarters to not pay global income tax or income tax in whichever country that they are in, right? I don't know what all of that spans. But I think in general, I think these are just, for me, these are just, stories. You hear one country here, one country there, that is like in the right direction of this like end of the decade Web3 becomes like the norm and we don't talk about Web3 anymore, and then like NFTs become the norm, and like blockchain becomes the norm, and then cryptocurrencies become the norm, and they're part of this like crypto environment, but not necessarily seen as like a threat to government currency, but more as like the next wave of digital products that make people more financially secure, innovation in software, innovation in money, etc.
Well, it was interesting because the article was talking about having an India native web browser, and that like this token payment was going to be an extension of that web browser. And it's always interesting to see, like, for a country like India or China or Japan, in order for them to grow and have their own independence and sovereignty, how much do they need to have their own technology base? They need to have their own like currency controls and those sorts of things. Like, how much of this represents getting away from American technology companies? Like, do they want to avoid Google and its reach into their country, or Amazon and things like that? Do you think that's important for sovereignty for a country like India?
I mean, I'm sure that politicians might try to play that card, but it doesn't make that doesn't really make sense to me from like a geopolitical or like a sovereign perspective, right? Like, I think that in general, American companies have done more to like listen to the other countries' like laws than not, right? And so obviously every country wants their own people to start companies, because at the end of the day, most of the value flows back to the investors in those companies. But like in reality, when Google comes to India, like India's been, especially in IT, like Google comes to India and they hire a bunch of Indians who are making way more money than they would have doing something else, right? Now, if Indian companies start doing the same thing, that's better for India, because then the shareholders are Indians. So at some point that value goes, stays in India, right? But it's not one of these like mining companies or natural resources companies where they like, dig, take all the stuff and leave, right? And leave like a wasteland or something like that. So I don't generally tend to buy that argument, though. I think any sort of like pro-nationalist government, or even just a government that like wants more of their native companies to do better, would make that argument. But I don't buy that.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I do have another interesting story about ML and Web3, if you're interested in hearing about this one.
Yes, absolutely.
There is some actual growth. I mean, we've both spent some amount of time in the machine learning and Web3 space over the past year or so. And, it's always kind of an interesting question of how the two overlap. Web3 data sets are often relatively small, and so you can do basic analytics off-chain, and it's not too complicated. There was an interesting paper at SBC Summit last week that was named, it was called Lantern. It was called Measuring Economic Security of Smart Contracts Through Adaptive Learning. And it was basically using different types of machine learning techniques to find where smart contract vulnerability is going to happen. Smart contract vulnerabilities are a massive industry. There's so many multi-$100 million thefts and hacks and break-ins that happen in a given year. It's big money for black hat hackers. And so now what this article from the Defiant was talking about is the growth of machine learning and data science generally in the Web3 space, but specifically for the purpose of doing more analytics on smart contract vulnerabilities, trying to find them proactively, trying to look at movement of contract balances in real time to kind of proactively predict where a hack might be occurring, or sort of anomalous behavior and things like that. I'm curious if you've seen any of that sort of use case, or if you hear any of that demand from your side.
Yes, there's a lot there. So I think, first of all, there's like a lot of intersections for ML and Web3, and I'd love to talk about that in a little bit. On the smart contract stuff, like, my personal viewpoint is that this is like a interesting article, but like if you're cybersecurity, like think about cybersecurity, right? Any sort of cybersecurity, you use all the tools at your disposal to like make sure that you don't get hacked or you don't get attacked or there's no fraud, right? And every company, like let's say every financial company I've ever spoken to, they all use machine learning for fraud detection. So I think it's an interesting paper, right? But if I think about it pragmatically, I would be surprised if companies today who do smart contract protection and cybersecurity around smart contracts aren't using some sort of machine learning to understand what the previous attacks have been, right? And learn from that so those attacks can't happen again. Now, the problem with machine learning is that it's really hard to teach a machine to predict something that will happen in the future that's never happened before. Right? Like, how is humans, how is a machine going to learn that an attack, like a completely different form of attack, if there's some similarities around it, a machine learning algorithm can figure it out. Right? And so I would just say, like, hey, if you're in the business of doing smart contract cybersecurity, this is one of the many tools at your disposal, right? And I'm sure there are people doing really interesting stuff. Like, one form of machine learning is looking at past attacks, learning how those happen and protecting yourself from it. Another form of machine learning is maybe you look at past attacks, but you look at the source code of where it attacked and you train on that. And maybe if maybe a large language model can figure out similarities to that kind of code flow. Now, I'm making this up, but I'm sure that someone is trying this or doing this. But like, that is another form of, like, there isn't just within machine learning. What I'm trying to say is there's just not like, oh, I use machine learning, so I'm done, right? There's going to be like different forms. There's going to be on source code. There's going to be on smart contract. There's going to be on extensions and wallets. There's going to be on a whole, like user behavior and transaction and all of that. So that's, I think, well, I thought the article was super interesting, but for me, it's like, okay, so like, we're talking about one more tool in like a cybersecurity company's firm. That's kind of my viewpoint on this. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, like, the interesting thing is like, how much of existing Web2 security practices can you reapply to smart contracts? I had a friend who was spent 10 years consulting in Web2 security, and now they're involved in Web3 security. And I mean, a lot of the traditional Web2 technologies apply to Web3 organizations because Web3 organizations have Gmail accounts, they have Amazon accounts, and some of that perimeter stuff still applies. But it seems like it's a bit of an emerging space, particularly because a lot of the data sets around the blockchain space are sort of unique in the sense that the blockchain is constantly creating this real-time data set, almost like a stock market, but the stock market didn't have to worry about being hacked in the same way necessarily. Like, it wasn't a threat of necessarily like, balances being stolen. So I think there's definitely like some room for innovation there. So we'll see if it turns into like a full-fledged enough. I think at the end of the day, like, people are always interested in like onboarding Web2 users, and like this could be a potential opportunity to get like data scientists who would otherwise dismiss Web3 interested. Yeah, but it might just be a bit of a fad.
So like, there's some stuff that happened, like Web2 best security practices, right? This can be about like IT policy, about two-factor authentication, about password security, about single sign-on, and all the other things that companies do for, let's just call it IT privacy and security policy. Then there's all this other cybersecurity of like, making sure your software doesn't actually get hacked, right? There's like DOS attacks, there's like buffer overflow attacks, like just a lot of different stuff in like computer science, right? Of like known ways that like how computers actually run. Obviously a lot of those things still apply, because at the end of the day, we're still, everything still compiles down to like assembly or machine code. But where do you think in Web3, like the surface of new attacks have like really developed, right?
Well, a lot of them have happened at the compiler level. Like the one that was really big recently with the curve pool hack that happened because of a compiler level issue. It wasn't the Solidity compiler, but it was the Viper compiler. It had some they were actually Curve, which was one of the larger decentralized exchanges, was running an older version of the compiler. And because of that, people were able to inject some malicious code. So it's like very low level stuff that maybe wasn't always, it's like each of these hacks has like a degree of like novelty to it. Like they found something unique that had happened before. A lot of the other ones in the bridges, they'll find like an opcode, like a low level like instruction that allows them to insert some code or some instruction Like the wormhole bridge attack was a good example of this. There was a, I think on the bridge side, not ETH, but it was the other side of whatever, bridging it to Solana or whatever other system it was. There was basically a vulnerability in the language that they were able to exploit. So it's so those are most of the ones that I've seen. I think there's some other ones you can do where you're like front running, and if you have like a lot of currency, you can actually move currency around in specific ways to sandwich attack and other things, like take advantage of other people's transactions. But it does seem like there's a degree of novelty. Like to your point, like about like it has to be net new things that they're finding. The generative LLM space seems like most interesting in that way, because it's like tell the LLM find some hack that I didn't think of, which I mean it's kind of doing. It can somewhat sometimes do that with Web2 code. Find the error in this code in some sense. So yeah, I bet you there are people who are applying that today.
But like if you think about it, right, in a couple of those examples, one was like someone didn't update their software. That's like Web2, Web3 doesn't matter, right? Like, I mean, I think companies need to figure out, like, have better policies around, like, okay, in blockchain, transactions are reversible. So you have to be a lot more careful. You have to be a lot more careful on your engineering team of like, hey, like my software dependency just upgraded it. Like we need to upgrade ours so that, and see if there are any, test breaking or if there are any new bugs, right? And then there's another issue is that basically if there's a security hole in the actual blockchain that you're using, even if you've done everything, you're kind of screwed, right? Maybe like Ethereum is a little bit worse of an example, or maybe it's like back in the day was a better example is when they were first building it. Like when you're building something new, there's going to be vulnerabilities that you will never think of, right? Because people will do things that you will never think of. But that's true with new blockchains, right? Like anyone who's building an app chain or a layer 1 or a layer 2 now needs to think about, like, now they're like, okay, how do you get people to like attack it during testnet, basically do things that you wouldn't see. So I feel that, like, there's all this like blockchain code that's being written, right? Like it would be great for someone to figure out like what are new ways of like defending from attacks on that side. And I do agree with you. I think like generative LLMs are probably going to be a big way, but also like in other examples, just classic security policies of, that have been built over good decades, update your software, have 2-factor, blah, 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 are also probably going to be
very true. That'd be a fun guest to have on the podcast next time. Is at some point in the future is someone who's got like a deep Web3 security engineer. Pick their brain on the topic.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Another interesting thing from the article that I wanted to ask you about is that I think there was a quote that was interesting. It's like, while Web3 has attracted many developers, it hasn't been able to attract a lot of data scientists so far. The industry need to make Web3 more appealing to data scientists, providing incentives to make this niche appealing. Why do you think that every time a Web3 person starts a crypto AI intersection company, like, it hasn't gotten the users or the demand from the developer side or whatever? Why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some graveyards in the crypto AI space. Well, some of them were trying to solve problems that absolutely can be solved well with Web2 technology. And that's the most unfortunate thing is, like, I saw some like ChatGPT inference examples, platforms that were Web3 oriented, but they were things that could have been solved very easily. Like, we have some documentation and maybe we're going to use a ChatGPT technology to help you read through our Web3 projects, blogs or interact with it. And this is like the sort of thing that you could very easily solve with Web2. So I think that the part of the challenge is, like, what AI and ML are large data sets that are traditionally built over time with like Web2 technologies. And Web3 technologies just don't have the same data footprint yet. So there hasn't been as much of a need to validate them. But even when you do validate them, right now, sometimes there's enough trust for doing so offline. I think there's also a lot of interesting investment in terms of like building those AI platforms that can do trustless off-chain computing or trustless off-chain training. We haven't really seen those platforms yet. Like, there isn't really a good example of that yet. So maybe once those platforms exist, people will come up with some novel use cases that we haven't seen, that we haven't thought of before.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense to me. I think for me, it's been mostly the same as like other stuff. It's not just for AI is that like a lot of times people think that, oh, I'm going to decentralize this or I'm going to make a token around this and people will come, and it's like, no, what problem are you actually solving, right? Like do people care? Like, are you solving a pain point? Well, will you capture value? And a lot of the times, a lot of like the Web3 enthusiasts are like, if I decentralize it, life will be better or technology will be better. And it's like, will it? I don't know.
No, it's got to be more. It really does. It has to be, it can, like there are some scenarios I'm sure where decentralization can make it better, but you've got to make a very clear case. You can't use the broad terms, especially in a bear market.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's not that I don't think Web3 can make it better. I think it's the attitude around it, where it's like, instead of going out and, doing classic GTM and finding your users and finding your customers and talking to them and understanding their pain point, we end up just being like, hey, here's a Web3 solution to something you already have, come use it. Like, I don't think it's a technology issue. I think it's like it's a effort of like going and finding the real problem and working with your customers issue.
Well said. Well, Ishan, I apologize. I need to wrap up and head out here, but this was a lot of fun. I'm glad we got to get a few minutes to get the podcast in.
Yeah, I know. Shorter podcast than usual, but sometimes short is good. So glad we could make this happen. Sorry I was running late, but we'll have more content for next week, so that'll be fun. I'm excited for next week's pod also.
Likewise. All right, man. Have an excellent week. We'll catch you next time.
All right. See ya.
Cheers, bud.
Bye.